This is an audiobook for Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, continuing with Book 2, The Drawing of the Three. Part 1, The Prisoner, and Chapter 3, The Tower. 7. Eddie stood ready as the pizza truck pulled up. Roland stood even more ready inside of him. Just another version of Diana's dream, Roland thought. What was in the box, the golden bowl or the biter snake? And just as she turns the key and puts her hands upon the lid, she hears her mother calling, "Wake up, Diana. It's time to milk." Okay, Eddie thought. Which is it going to be, the lady or the tiger? The man with a pale, pimply face and big buck teeth looked out of the pizza truck's passenger window. It was a face Eddie knew. "Hi, Cole," Eddie said without much enthusiasm. Beyond Cole Vincent, sitting behind the wheel, was old Double Ugly, which was what Henry called Jack Andolini. But Henry never called him that to his face, Eddie thought. No, of course not. Calling Jack something like that to his face would be a wonderful way to get yourself killed. He was a huge man with a bulging caveman's forehead and a protagonist's jaw to match. He was related to Enrico Balazar by marriage, a niece or cousin or some fucking thing. His gigantic hands clung to the wheel of the delivery truck like the hands of a monkey clinging to a branch. Coarse sprouts of hair grew from his ears. Eddie could only see one of those ears now because Jack Andolini remained in profile, never looking around. Old Double Ugly, but not even Henry, who Eddie had to admit was not always the most perceptive guy in the world, had ever made the mistake of calling him Old Double Stupid. Colin Vincent was no more than a glorified gopher. Jack, however, had enough smarts behind him, that Neanderthal brow, to be Balazar's #1 lieutenant. Eddie didn't like the fact that Balazar had sent a man of such importance. He didn't like it at all. "Hi, Eddie," Cole said. "Heard you had some trouble." "Nothing I couldn't handle," Eddie said. He realized he was scratching first one arm, then the other, one of the typical junkie moves he had tried so hard to keep away from while they had him in custody. He made himself stop. But Cole was smiling, and Eddie felt an urge to slam a fist all the way through that smile and out the other side. He might have done it too, except for Jack. Jack was still staring straight ahead, a man who seemed to be thinking his own rudimentary thoughts as he observed the world in the simple primary colors and elementary notions, which were all a man of such intellect, or so you'd think looking at him, could perceive. Yet Eddie thought Jack saw more in a single day than Cole Vincent would in his whole life. "Well, good," Cole said. "That's good." Silence. Cole looked at Eddie, smiling, waiting for Eddie to start the junkie shuffle again, scratching, shifting from foot to foot like a kid who needs to go to the bathroom, waiting mostly for Eddie to ask what was up, and by the way, did they just happen to have any stuff on them? Eddie only looked back at him, not scratching now, not moving at all. A faint breeze blew a ring-ding wrapper across the parking lot, the scratchy sounds of its skittering passage, and the wheezy thump of the pizza's truck's loose valves were the only sounds. Cole's knowing grin began to falter. "Hop in, Eddie," Jack said without looking around. "Let's take a ride." "Where?" Eddie asked, knowing. "Balazar's." Jack didn't look around. He flexed his hands on the wheel. Once. A large ring, solid gold except for the onyx stone which bulged from it like the eye of a giant insect, glittered on the third finger of his right hand as he did it. "He wants to know about his goods." "I have his goods. They're safe." "Fine. Then nobody has anything to worry about," Jack Andolini said, and did not look around. "I think I want to go upstairs first," Eddie said. "I want to change my clothes, talk to Henry, and get fixed up, don't forget that," Cole said, and grinned with his big, yellow-toothed grin, "except you got nothing to fix with, little chum." "Data chum?" the gunslinger thought in Eddie's mind, and both of them shuddered a little. Cole observed the shudder, and his smile widened. "Oh, here it is, after all," that smile said. "The good old junkie shuffle. Had me worried there for a minute, Eddie." The teeth revealed by that smile's expansion were not an improvement on those previously seen. "Why's that?" "Mr. Balazar thought it would be better to make sure you guys had a clean place," Jack said without looking around. He went on observing the world. An observer would have believed it impossible for such a man to observe, in case anyone showed up. "People with a federal warrant, for instance," Cole said. His face hung and leered. Now Eddie could feel Roland also wanting to drive a fist through the rotted teeth that made the grin so reprehensible, so somehow irredeemable. The unanimity of feeling cheered him a little. "He sent in a cleaning service to wash the walls and vacuum the carpets, and he ain't going to charge you a red cent for it, Eddie." Now you'll ask what I've got, Cole's grin said. Oh, yeah, now you'll ask, Eddie, my boy, because you may not love the candy man, but you do love the candy, don't you? And now that you know Balazar's made sure your own private stash is gone. A sudden thought, both ugly and frightening, flashed through his mind. If the stash was gone. Where's Henry? He said suddenly, so harshly that Cole drew back, surprised. Jack Andolini finally turned his head. He did so slowly, as if it was an act he performed only rarely, and at great personal cost. You almost expected to hear old, oilless hinges creaking inside the thickness of his neck. Safe, he said, and then turned his head back to its original position again, just as slowly. Eddie stood beside the pizza truck, fighting the panic trying to rise in his mind and drown coherent thought. Suddenly, the need to fix, which he had been holding at bay pretty well, was overpowering. He had to fix. With a fix he could think, get himself under control. Quit it, Roland roared inside his mind. So loud Eddie winced, and Cole, mistaking Eddie's grimace of pain and surprise for another little step in the junkie shuffle, began to grin again. Quit it. I'll be all the goddamned control you need. You don't understand. He's my brother. He's my fucking brother. Balazar's got my brother. You speak as if it is a word I'd never heard before. Do you fear for him? Yes, Christ, yes. Then do what they expect. Cry, pule, and beg. Ask for this fix of yours. I'm sure they expect you to, and I'm sure they have it. Do all those things. Make them sure of you, and you can be sure all of your fears will be justified. I don't understand what you I mean, if you show a yellow gut, you will go far toward getting your precious brother killed. Is that what you want? All right, I'll be cool. It may not sound that way, but I'll be cool. Is that what you call it? All right then. Yes, be cool. This isn't the way the deal was supposed to go down, Eddie said, speaking past Cole and directly at Jack Andolini's tufted ear. This isn't why I took care of Balazar's goods and hung on to my lip while some other guy would have been puking out 5 names for every year off on the plea bargain. Balazar thought your brother would be safer with him, Jack said, not looking around. He took him into protective custody. Well, good, Eddie said. You thank him for me, and you tell him that I'm back. His goods are safe, and I can take care of Henry just like Henry always took care of me. You tell him I'll have a 6-pack on ice, and when Henry walks in the place, we're going to split it, and then we'll get in our car and come on into town and do the deal like it was supposed to be done, like we talked about it. Balazar wants to see you, Eddie, Jack said. His voice was implacable, immovable. His head did not turn. Get in the truck. Stick it where the sun don't shine, motherfucker, Eddie said, and started for the doors to his building. 8. It was a short distance, but he had barely gotten halfway when Andolini's hand clamped on his upper arm with the paralyzing force of a vice grip. His breath was as hot as a bull's on the back of Eddie's neck. He did all this in the time you would have thought, looking at him, it would have taken his brain to convince his hand to pull the door handle up. Eddie turned around. Be cool, Eddie, Roland whispered. Cool, Eddie responded. I could kill you for that, Andolini said. No one tells me to stick it up my ass, especially no shit-ass little junkie like you. Kill shit, Eddie screamed at him. But it was a calculated scream, a cool scream, if you could dig that. They stood there, dark figures in the golden horizontal light of late spring sundown, in the wasteland of housing developments that is the Bronx Co-op City, and people heard the scream, and people heard the word kill. And if their radios were on, they turned them up, and if their radios were off, they turned them on, and then turned them up, because it was better that way. Safer. Rico Balazar broke his word. I stood up for him and he didn't stand up for me. So I tell you to stick it up your fucking ass. I tell him to stick it up his fucking ass. I tell anybody I want to stick it up his fucking ass. Andolini looked at him. His eyes were so brown the color seemed to have leaked into his corneas, turning them the yellow of old parchment. I tell President Reagan to stick it up his ass if he breaks his word to me, and fuck his fucking rectal palp or whatever it is. The words died away in echoes on brick and concrete. A single child, his skin very black against his white basketball shorts and high-topped sneakers, stood in the playground across the street, watching them, a basketball held loosely against his side in the crook of his elbow. You done? Andolini asked when the last of the echoes were gone. Yes, Eddie said in a completely normal tone of voice. Okay, Andolini said. He spread his anthropoid fingers and smiled. And when he smiled, 2 things happened simultaneously. The first was that you saw a charm that was so surprising it had its way of leaving people defenseless. The second was that you saw how bright he really was, how dangerously bright. Now can we start over? Eddie brushed his hands through his hair, crossed his arms briefly so he could scratch both arms at the same time, and said, I think we better because this is going nowhere. Okay, Andolini said. No one has said nothing, and no one has ranked out anyone. And without turning his head or breaking the rhythm of his speech, he added, "Get back in the truck, dumbwit." Cole Vincent, who had climbed cautiously out of the delivery truck through the door Antolini had left open, retreated so fast he thumped his head. He slid across the seat and slouched in his former place, rubbing it and sulking. "You gotta understand, the deal changed when the customs people put the arm on you," Andolini said reasonably. "Balazar is a big man. He has interests to protect, people to protect. One of those people, it just so happens, is your brother Henry. You think that's bullshit? If you do, you better think about the way Henry is now." "Henry's fine," Eddie said, but he knew better and he couldn't keep the knowing out of his voice. He heard it and knew Jack Andolini heard it too. These days, Henry was always on the nod, it seemed like. There were holes in his shirts from cigarette burns. He had cut the shit out of his hand using the electric can opener on a can of Callow for Potsy, their cat. Eddie didn't know how you cut yourself with an electric can opener, but Henry had managed it. Sometimes the kitchen table would be powdery with Henry's leavings, or Eddie would find blackened curls of char in the bathroom sink. "Henry," he would say, "Henry, you gotta take care of this. This is getting out of hand. You're a bust walking around and waiting to happen." "Yeah, okay, little brother," Henry would respond. "Zero perspiration. I got it all under control." But sometimes, looking at Henry's ashy face and burned out eyes, Eddie knew Henry was never going to have anything under control again. What he wanted to say to Henry and couldn't had nothing to do with Henry getting busted or getting them both busted. What he wanted to say was, "Henry, it's like you're looking for a room to die in. That's how it looks to me. And I want you to fucking quit it, because if you die, what did I live for?" "Henry isn't fine," Jack Andolini said. "He needs someone to watch out for him. He needs, what's that song say? A bridge over troubled waters. That's what Henry needs. A bridge over troubled waters. Il Roche is being that bridge." "Il Roche is a bridge to hell," Eddie thought. Out loud, he said, "That's where Henry is, at Balazar's place?" "Yes. I give him the goods. He gives me Henry." "And your goods," Andolini said. "Don't forget that. The deal goes back to normal, in other words." "Right. Now, tell me you think that's really going to happen. Come on, Jack, tell me. I want to see if you can do it with a straight face. And if you can do it with a straight face, I want to see how much your nose grows." "I don't understand you, Eddie." "Sure you do. Balazar thinks I've got his goods. If he thinks that, he must be stupid, and I know he's not stupid." "I don't know what he thinks," Andolini said serenely. "It's not my job to know what he thinks. He knows you had his goods when you left the islands. He knows customs grabbed you and then let you go. He knows you're here and not on your way to Rikers. He knows his goods have to be somewhere. And he knows customs is still all over me like a wetsuit on a skin diver, because you know it and you sent him some kind of coded message on the truck's radio. Something like 'double cheese, hold the anchovies.' Right, Jack?" Jack Andolini said nothing and looked serene. "Only you were just telling him something he already knew, like connecting the dots in a picture you can already see what it is." Andolini stood in the golden sunset light that was slowly turning furnace orange and continued to look serene and continued to say nothing at all. "He thinks they turned me. He thinks they're running me. He thinks I might be stupid enough to run. I don't exactly blame him. I mean, why not? A smackhead will do anything. You want to check? See if I'm wearing a wire?" "I know you're not," Andolini said. "I got something in the van. It's like a fuzz buster. Only it picks up short-range radio transmissions. And for what it's worth, I don't think you're running for the feds. Yeah?" "Yeah. So do we get in the van and go into the city, or what? Do I have a choice?" "No," Roland said inside his head. "No," Andolini said. Eddie went back to the van. The kid with the basketball was still standing across the street, his shadow now so long it was a gantry. "Get out of here, kid," Eddie said. "You were never here. You never saw nothing or no one. Fuck off." The kid ran. Cole was grinning at him. "Push over, champ," Eddie said. "I think you ought to sit in the middle, Eddie." "Push over," Eddie said again. Cole looked at him, then looked at Andolini, who did not look at him, but only pulled the driver's door closed, and looked serenely straight ahead, like a Buddha on his day off, leaving them to work the seating arrangements out for themselves. Cole glanced at Eddie's face and decided to push over. They headed into New York, and although the gunslinger, who could only stare wonderingly at the spires, even greater and more graceful, bridges that spanned a wide river like steel cobwebs, and rotored air carriages that hovered like strange man-made insects, did not know it, the place they were headed for was the tower. Like Andolini, Enrico Balazar did not think Eddie Dean was running for the feds. Like Andolini, Balazar knew it. The bar was empty. The sign on the door read "Closed, tonight only." Balazar sat in his office waiting for Andolini and Cole Vincent to arrive with the Dean Kid. His two personal bodyguards, Claudio Andolini, Jack's brother, and Simi Drezzo, were with him. They sat on the sofa to the left of Balazar's large desk, watching, fascinated, as the edifice Balazar was building grew. The door was open. Beyond the door was a short hallway. To the right, it led to the back of the bar and the little kitchen beyond, where a few simple pasta dishes were prepared. To the left was the accountant's office and the storage room. In the accountant's office, three more of Balazar's gentlemen, this was how they were known, were playing Trivial Pursuit with Henry Dean. Okay, George Biondi was saying. Here's an easy one, Henry. Henry. You there, Henry? Earth to Henry. Earth people need you. Come in, Henry. I say again, come in. I'm here. I'm here, Henry said. His voice was the slurry, muddy voice of a man who is still asleep, telling his wife he's awake so she'll leave him alone for another 5 minutes. Okay, the category is arts and entertainment. The question is, Henry, don't you fucking nod off on me, asshole. I'm not, Henry cried back querulously. Okay, the question is, what enormously popular novel by William Peter Blatty, set in the posh Washington, D.C. suburb of Georgetown, concerned the demonic possession of a young girl? Johnny Cash, Henry replied. Jesus Christ, Trix Pastino yelled. That's what you say to everything, Johnny Cash. That's what you say to fucking everything. Johnny Cash is everything, Henry replied gravely, and there was a moment of silence palpable in its considering surprise, then a gravelly burst of laughter, not just from the men in the room with Henry, but the other two gentlemen sitting in the storage room. You want me to shut the door, Mr. Balazar? Simi asked quietly. No, that's fine, Balazar said. He was second-generation Sicilian, but there was no trace of accent in his speech, nor was it the speech of a man whose only education had been in the streets. Unlike many of his contemporaries in the business, he had finished high school. Had, in fact, done more. For 2 years he had gone to business school, NYU. His voice, like his business methods, was quiet and cultured and American, and this made his physical aspect as deceiving as Jack Andolini's. People hearing his clear, unaccented American voice for the first time almost always looked dazed, as if hearing a particularly good piece of ventriloquism. He looked like a farmer or innkeeper or small-time mafioso who had been successful more by virtue of being at the right place at the right time than because of any brains. He looked like what the wise guys of a previous generation had called a mustache Pete. He was a fat man who dressed like a peasant. This evening, he wore a plain white cotton shirt open at the throat. There were spreading sweat stains beneath the arms, and plain gray twill pants. On his fat, sockless feet were brown loafers, so old they were more like slippers than shoes. Blue and purple varicose veins squirmed on his ankles. Simi and Claudia watched him, fascinated. In the old days, they had called him Il Rocher, the Rock. Some of the old-timers still did, always in the right-hand top drawer of his desk, where other businessmen might keep pads, pens, paper clips, things of that sort. Enrico Balazar kept 3 decks of cards. He did not play games with them, however. He built with them. He would take 2 cards and lean them against each other, making an A without the horizontal stroke. Next to it, he would make another A shape. Over the roof of the 2, he would lay a single card, making a roof. He would make A after A, overlaying each until his desk supported a house of cards. You bent over and looked in. You saw something that looked like a hive of triangles. Simi had seen these houses fall over hundreds of times. Claudio had also seen it happen from time to time, but not so frequently, because he was 30 years younger than Simi, who expected to soon retire with his bitch of a wife to a farm they owned in northern New Jersey, where he would devote all his time to his garden, and to outliving the bitch he had married, not his mother-in-law. He had long since given up any wistful notion that he might once have had of eating fettuccine at the wake of La Monstra. La Monstra was eternal, but for outliving the bitch, there was at least some hope. His father had a saying which, when translated, meant something like, God pisses down the back of your neck every day, but only drowns you once. And while Simi wasn't completely sure, he thought it meant God was a pretty good guy after all, and so he could only hope to outlive the one, if not the other, but had only seen Balazar put out of temper of such a fall on a single occasion. Mostly it was something errant that did it, someone closing a door hard in another room, or a drunk stumbling against a wall. There had been times when Simi saw an edifice Mr. Balazar, whom he still called the boss, like a character in a Chester Gold comic strip. had spent hours building fall down because the bass on the juke was too loud. Other times, these airy constructs fall down for no perceptible reason at all. Once, this was a story he had told at least 5,000 times, and one of which every person he knew, with the exception of himself, had tired. DeBoss had looked up at him from the ruins and said, "You see this, see me? For every mother who ever cursed God for her child dead in the road, for every father who ever cursed the man who sent him away from the factory with no job, for every child who was ever born to pain and asked why, this is the answer. Our lives are like these things I build. Sometimes they fall down for a reason, sometimes they fall down for no reason at all." Carlosimi Dretto thought this was the most profound statement of the human condition he had ever heard. That one time Balazar had been put out of temper by the collapse of one of his structures had been 12, maybe 14 years ago. There was a guy who came in to see him about booze, a guy with no class, no manners, a guy who smelled like he took a bath once a year whether he needed it or not. A Mick, in other words, and of course, it was booze. With Micks, it's always booze, never dope. And this Mick, he thought what was on DeBoss's desk was a joke. "Make a wish," he yelled, after DeBoss had explained to him, in the way one gentleman explains to another, why it was impossible for them to do business. And then the Mick, one of those guys with curly red hair and a complexion so white it looked like he had TB or something, one of those guys whose name started with O and then had that little curly mark between the O and the real name, had blown onto Boss's desk, like a Nino blowing out the candles on a birthday cake, and cards flew everywhere around Balazar's head, and Balazar had opened the left top drawer in his desk, the drawer where other businessmen might keep their personal stationery or their private memos or something like that, and he had brought out a 45, and he had shot the Mick in the head, and Balazar's expression never changed, and after Simi, and a guy named Truman Alexander, who had died of a heart attack 4 years ago, had buried the Mick under the chicken house somewhere outside of Seatonville, Connecticut, Balazar had said to Simi, "It's up to men to build things, Pison. It's up to God to blow them down. You agree?" "Yes, Mr. Balazar," Simi had said. He did agree. Balazar had nodded, pleased. "You did like I said? You put him someplace where chickens or ducks or something like that could shit on him?" "Yes." "That's very good," Balazar said calmly, and took a fresh deck of cards from the right top drawer of his desk. One level was not enough for Balazar, Il Rocher. Upon the roof of the first level he would build a second, only not quite so wide, and on top of the second a third, and on top of the third a fourth. He would go on, but after the fourth level he would have to stand to do so. You no longer had to bend much to look in, and when you did, what you saw wasn't rows of triangles, but a fragile, bewildering, and impossibly lovely hall of diamond shapes. You looked in too long, you felt dizzy. Once, Simi had gone in the mirror maze at Coney, and he had felt like that. He had never gone in again. Simi said he believed no one believed him. The truth was, no one cared one way or the other. He once seen Balazar build something which was no longer a house of cards, but was a tower of cards, one which stood 9 levels high before it collapsed. That no one gave a shit about this was something Simi didn't know, because everyone he told affected amazement because he was close to DeBoss. But they would have been amazed if he had said the words to describe it. How delicate it had been, how it reached almost 3/4 to the way from the top of the desk to the ceiling, a lacy construct of jacks and deuces and kings and tens and big acres, a red and black configuration of paper diamonds standing in defiance of a world spinning through a universe of incoherent motions and forces, a tower that seemed to Simi's amazed eyes to be a ringing denial of all the unfair paradoxes of life. If he had known how, he would have said, "I looked at what he built, and to me it explained the stars." 10. Balazar knew how everything would have to be. The feds had smelled Eddie. Maybe he had been stupid to send Eddie in the first place. Maybe his instincts were failing him. But Eddie had seemed somehow so right, so perfect. His uncle, the first man he had worked for in the business, said there were exceptions to every rule but one: never trust a junkie. Balazar had said nothing. It was not the place of a boy of 15 to speak, even if only to agree, but privately had thought the only rule to which there was no exception was that there were some rules for which that was not true. But if Tio Verone were alive today, Balazar thought, he would laugh at you and say, "Look, Rico, you always were too smart for your own good. You knew the rules, you kept your mouth shut when it was respectful to keep it shut, but you always had that snot look in your eyes. You always knew too much about how smart you were, and so you finally fell into the pit of your own pride, just like I always knew you would." He made an A shape and overlaid it. They had taken Eddie and held him a while, and then let him go. Balazar had grabbed Eddie's brother and the stash they shared. That would be enough to bring him, and he wanted Eddie. He wanted Eddie because it had only been 2 hours, and 2 hours was wrong. They had questioned him at Kennedy, not at 43rd Street, and that was wrong too. That meant Eddie had succeeded in ditching most, or all, of the coke. Or had he? He thought. He wondered. Eddie had walked out of Kennedy 2 hours after they took him off the plane. That was too short of a time for them to have sweated it out of him and too long for them to have decided he was clean. That some stew had made a rash mistake. He thought. He wondered. Eddie's brother was a zombie, but Eddie was still smart. Eddie was still tough. He wouldn't have turned in just 2 hours, unless it was his brother. Something about his brother. But still, how come no 43rd Street? How come no customs van? The ones that looked like post office trucks except for the wire grills on the back windows. Because Eddie really had done something with the goods, ditched them, hidden them. Impossible to hide goods on an airplane. Impossible to ditch them. Of course, it was also impossible to escape from certain prisons, rob certain banks, beat certain raps, but people did. Harry Houdini had escaped from straitjackets, locked trunks, fucking bank vaults, but Eddie Dean was no Houdini. Was he? He could have had Henry killed in the apartment, could have had Eddie cut down on the LIE, or better yet, also in the apartment, where it would look to the cops like a couple of junkies who got desperate enough to forget they were brothers and killed each other. But it would leave too many questions unanswered. He would get the answers here, prepare for the future, or merely satisfy his curiosity, depending on what the answers were, and then kill both of them. A few more answers, two less junkies. Some gain, and no great loss. In the other room, the game had gotten around to Henry again. Okay, Henry, George Biondi said. Be careful because this one is tricky. The category is geography. The question is, what is the only continent where kangaroos are a native form of life? A hushed pause. Johnny Cash, Henry said, and this was followed by a bull-throated roar of laughter. The walls shook. Simi tensed, waiting for Balazar's house of cards, which would become a tower only if God or the blind forces that ran the universe in his name willed it to fall down. The cards trembled a bit. If one fell, all would fall. None did. Balazar looked up at Simi and smiled. Piasin, he said, Il dio est bono, il dio est malo, tempses poco poco, tu est un grande piparolo. Simi smiled. Si, signor, he said, io grande piparolo. Io va fanculo per tu. Non va fanculo, cazzaro, Balazar said. Eddie Dean va fanculo. He smiled gently and began on the second level of his tower of cards. 11. When the van pulled to the curb near Balazar's place, Cole Vincent happened to be looking at Eddie. He saw something impossible. He tried to speak and found himself unable. His tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth, and all he could get out was a muffled grunt. He saw Eddie's eyes change from brown to blue. 12. This time, Roland made no conscious decision to come forward. He simply leaped without thinking, a movement as involuntary as rolling out of a chair and going for his guns when someone burst into a room. The tower, he thought fiercely. It's the tower, my God. The tower is in the sky. The tower, I see the tower in the sky. Drawn in the lines of red fire, Cuthbert Allen Desmond, the tower, But this time, he felt Eddie struggling, not against him, but trying to talk to him. Trying desperately to explain something to him. The gunslinger retreated, listening desperately, as above a beach some unknown distance away, in space and time, his mindless body twitched and trembled like the body of a man experiencing a dream of highest ecstasy or deepest horror. 13. Sign, Eddie was screaming into his own head and into the head of that other. It's a sign, just a neon sign. I don't know what tower it is you're thinking about, but this is just a bar, Balazar's place. The Leaning Tower, he named it after the one in Pisa. It's just a sign that's supposed to look like the fucking Leaning Tower of Pisa. Let up. You want to get us killed before we have a chance to go with them? Pizza? The gunslinger replied doubtfully. He looked up again. A sign? Yes, all right, he could see it now. It was not the tower, but a signpost. It leaned to one side, and there were many scalloped curves. And it was a marvel, but that was all. He could see now that the sign was a thing made of tubes which had somehow been filled with glowing red swamp fire. In some places there seemed to be less of it than others. In those places the lines of fire pulsed and buzzed. He now saw letters below the tower which had been made of shaped tubes. Most of them were great letters. Tower, he could read, and yes, leaning tower. The first word was 3 letters. The first T, the last E. The middle one, which he had never seen. Trey? He asked Eddie. It doesn't matter. Do you see it's a sign? That's what matters. I see, the gunslinger answered, wondering if the prisoner was really believed what he was saying, or was only trying to keep the situation from spilling over as the tower depicted in those lines of fire seemed about to do, wondering if Eddie believed any sign could be a trivial thing. Then ease off, do you hear me? Ease off. Be cool? Roland asked, and both felt Roland smile a little in Eddie's mind. Be cool. Right. Let me handle things. Yes, all right. He would let Eddie handle things. For now. 14. Cole Vincent finally managed to get his tongue off the roof of his mouth. Jack, his voice was as thick as shag carpet. Andolini turned off the motor and looked at him, irritated. His eyes. What about his eyes? Yeah, what about my eyes? Eddie asked. Cole looked at him. The sun had gone down, leaving nothing in the air but the day's ashes, but there was light enough for Cole to see that Eddie's eyes were brown again, if they had ever been anything else. You saw it, part of his mind insisted. But had he? Cole was 24, and for the last 21 of those years, no one had really believed him trustworthy. Useful sometimes, obedient almost always, if kept on a short leash. Trustworthy? No. Cole had eventually come to believe it himself. Nothing, he muttered. Then let's go, Andolini said. They got out of the pizza van. With Andolini on their left and Vincent on their right, Eddie and the gunslinger walked into the Leaning Tower.